Is Zac Jones set to finally become a mainstay in the New York Ranger lineup? We discuss, and we're also going to talk about something for which Braden Schneider does not get nearly enough credit.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1155 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, our intro song is Leave the Lights On from our very good friends in Passafire. You can check those guys out anywhere you get your music. And today, going to continue with getting toward the tail end of this, our fun-filled offseason series where we take a look at every single player projected to be on the opening night roster, and we talk about the best and worst case scenarios for all those players. Today, we're going to be talking about Zac Jones and also Braden Schneider. So let's go ahead and start with Zac Jones. I think in a worst case scenario for Zac Jones, and a lot of you have brought this up, and it is a fair point to make. I think in a worst case for Jones, his lack of size works against him. And when I say this, I tend to think a little bit more of playoff hockey than regular season hockey, but obviously it's something that, can affect him in regular season games as well. For reference, Zac Jones is 5'10", 172 pounds, which is not to say he's small, but compared to his peers, compared to other NHL defensemen, he certainly is. I got to think without, looking this up and looking at everybody's height and weight around the NHL. When you look at NHL defensemen, this has to be in the bottom 5 or at least bottom 10% in terms of size. But by that same token, that doesn't mean that there's, not any hope whatsoever. We've seen a lot of smaller defensemen go on to have great careers, in some cases, NHL Hall of Fame careers. But I do think, those concerns, the people that have voiced those concerns about his frame are valid when it comes especially to the Stanley Cup playoffs. Because as I've said in the past, I do feel like the Rangers are a little bit underrated in the physicality and toughness department. There's a lot of stats that back that up as well from last year. Not going to get into all those in great detail here today. But then you think about a team like the Panthers, a team that kind of thrives in playoff style hockey, that physicality. And, I know a lot of people are worried about the Panthers right now. A lot has to happen for the Rangers and Panthers to meet each other again in the playoffs. Unless one of those teams is a wild card, the earliest they can play each other, the only round they can play each other is the Eastern Conference Final. And at that point, yeah, obviously, it's going to be a tough matchup, and we know that. But I think at that point, you're in the Eastern Conference Final, and you'll take your chances. But using them as an example, such a heavy team, such a physical team, just relentless on the forecheck. And we saw the Rangers in general. That was a tough matchup for them. And the Ranger defensemen that were on the ice in the conference final last year against the Panthers. Obviously, Zac Jones did not play in that series, did not play in the entire playoff run for the Rangers. But, some bigger Ranger defensemen like, Miller and Trouba, if those guys are struggling against, the Panthers, their physicality and their relentless forecheck like I was talking about, it does lead you to believe that could be a problem for somebody like Zac Jones. Zac Jones does give up a lot of height and a lot of weight to his opponents. There's not really a whole lot we can do about that other than just basically, hope that he can hold his own when he is matched up against, tougher opponents and bigger opponents more accurately. I think also in a worst case for Zac Jones, he once again ends up being squeezed out of the lineup and once again is the odd man out as it pertains to the Ranger defenseman core. I don't think this will happen, but the way things are aligning right now, it wouldn't be the craziest thing, that's ever happened if that was to occur a little bit later in the season. Let me explain why. For starters, Ryan Lindgren has an injury. Now, even if Lindgren didn't get hurt, I still think that probably you would have seen Zac Jones in the lineup. The fact that Lindgren got hurt, whatever small chance there was of Zac Jones not being in the opening night lineup, that is now gone. He's going to be out there. We know that for sure. However, it also opens the door, Lindgren's injury that is, for another Ranger defenseman to obviously step into the opening night lineup. I think it's going to be Victor Mancini. I think it should be Victor Mancini. There's a lot of guys, gunning for that spot. Some young guys, some veterans, some journeymen. But I think when you look at everything that's happened between the rookie games, the preseason, training camp, I think Mancini has outplayed all of them. He's their own homegrown guy. Could be a late round steal. We'll see how it goes, but I feel like it should be Mancini. Well, fast forward now a couple of weeks, a couple of months, however long it takes for Ryan Lindgren to get back into the lineup. We don't know. They said, he'll be out for at least a few weeks, and that's very vague. We don't even know what the actual injury is. But sooner, it's not a season ender, right? So eventually, Ryan Lindgren is going to get healthy. He's going to come back into the lineup. At that time, assuming everybody's healthy, which that's kind of a big assumption, but let's just go with it right now. Let's say everybody's healthy. Ryan Lindgren will get back into the lineup. And conventional wisdom would be that Victor Mancini would be the odd man out at that point. But what if Victor Mancini is awesome? I mean, he's been awesome in the preseason and in the rookie games. I realize the regular season is a whole different monster. The games count, and obviously everybody's, competing full bore every single night. But if Mancini really starts to emerge in the absence of Ryan Lindgren, then Lindgren's going to get back into the lineup, and it won't be Mancini that comes out of the lineup. It'll be Zac Jones again. And at that point, I don't even know what to do. It'd be a situation just kind of like last year where Jones doesn't really do anything wrong, but he's just not in the top 6. He's not in the top 6 in the pecking order. And again, that won't be anybody's fault. You can't fault Mancini. I mean, if he goes out there and plays very well and remains in the lineup, after Lindgren comes back, I mean, more power to him. That's great news if you're a Ranger fan that Mancini's playing that well. The only person that it wouldn't be good news for is Zac Jones. So this kind of leads me into the next thing that I want to talk about. And again, this is a worst case scenario. I don't know that things are going to shake out this way, but in a worst case scenario, I think it's at least possible, if everything unfolds the way that I just laid it out, that Zac Jones at one time or another this upcoming season actually gets traded. We've seen the last couple of deadlines, the Rangers tend to bring in, players at the deadline, and they've had, different kinds of results at the deadline. They've gone for star players, they've gone for role players, but one thing is for sure, Drury, the Ranger front office, they are very active when it comes to the trade deadline. Well, if you want to really push your chips in and really, really, really go for it this year, and, there could be a situation where Igor Shesterkin still does not have a new contract at that point. So you could be in a situation where there's at least a chance that this is Igor's last, season with the Rangers. I would think that would make you want to be aggressive at the deadline. And, they've traded a lot of draft picks over the years, and that's fine. I think you have to do what you have to do to make your team better. But if you don't want to trade draft picks, or if there's a team that has interest in Zac Jones, I think, he could become, a somewhat appealing trade chip for teams around the league. They're looking to sell at the trade deadline and stock up on some younger players and some prospects. So in a worst case scenario for Zac Jones, he could end up getting dealt at the trade deadline. I think also in a worst case, and this is something that I've talked about with Jones in the past, but it's been a while. There could be a situation where he is a somewhat redundant player for the New York Rangers. It's nice to have defensemen that can contribute offensively. I think every team wants at least one or two of those guys that can, do some work on the power play, guys that will contribute from a scoring perspective. You don't want 6, stay at home defensemen. You want somebody that can jump into the play and give you some points. So that's all well and good. And Zac Jones, should be able to do that. But when you look at the Rangers, they're not hurting in that department. They're not hurting as far as, defensemen that contribute a little bit offensively. Adam Fox, he could be a point per game defenseman. That's within the realm of possibility for Adam Fox any given season. And even if he's not, he's going to be a spectacular offensive defenseman in addition to what he does defensively as well. Just an awesome defenseman all around. Keandre Miller. Now, his points were down a little bit this last year, but he's just 2 seasons removed from being a half point per game player from the blue line. We know he can contribute offensively, and he's fully capable, I think, of handling the second power play unit. I think that second power play unit, you're either going to see Miller or Jones. We'll talk about that a little bit later in today's episode. But to continue going through the defenseman here, Trouba's been down a little bit in the point department, but you got to figure, he'll get a decent amount of assists every single season. And maybe even Schneider. Schneider might have a little bit more to offer offensively. We'll talk about Schneider a little bit later in today's episode as well. And of course, Jones himself. So Jones' best trait, theoretically, is being an offensive defenseman, being somebody that can quarterback a power play, being somebody that can see the ice really well, make some really good passes, seems to be, a high IQ kind of player. And again, that's great, but are there teams out there that need a defenseman like that more than the Rangers do, based on the Rangers personnel, based on the fact that they have so many strong offensive defensemen? That's at least possible. And if the Rangers come to that realization themselves, then it goes back to something that I talked about just a minute ago. Jones could be somewhat expendable, as a trade piece at or near the trade deadline this season. But those are the worst case scenarios. And as we always do, We want to end on the positives. We want to end on the best case scenarios for every single player that we talk about. And we're going to do exactly that with Zac Jones in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you do not have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. You've got Gametime Picks. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. You've got all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views. Get a panoramic view of your seat in the app before you buy. Absolutely love that feature. The lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It is game time. All right, let's go keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Big shout out to the everydayers as always, for sticking with this podcast throughout, the entire NHL calendar and everything that the Rangers do, all the ups and the downs. Definitely want to conclude our best and worst case scenarios in a future episode with Jacob Trouba, the last player remaining that we projected for an opening night roster spot. So we'll talk about him. Also going to have thoughts on the Rangers opening night roster. That's going to be a fun episode as well. And of course, going to do the episode where all of you have shared your stories about, your experiences during the Rangers run in the playoffs this past season. But for right now, best case scenarios for Zac Jones. I think in a best case, and this is something that goes back to, really all of last season, but I think especially in the playoffs, when the Rangers against the Panthers for sure, maybe against the Canes to a certain degree, were getting kind of trapped in their own zone. I think there were a lot of people that were looking for a puck-moving defenseman, such as Zac Jones, maybe even just a guy with some fresh legs, such as Zac Jones, because he didn't get into any of the playoff games. But he's a puck-moving defenseman, and as we saw against the Panthers last year, and I guess this was an issue at times for the Rangers last season. They do seem to have some issue getting the puck out of their own zone on their breakouts. That's apparently something that they've been working at quite a bit in practice, which is obviously great to see. But that's an area where I think Zac Jones can really help this team. Again, he does seem to make really good decisions with the puck. He does seem to see the ice very well, and he's a very good passer. He can put it right on the tape. So in a situation where you're pinned in your own zone, Zac Jones might be able to get the puck moving in the opposite direction. So that's the best case scenario that he comes up big for the Rangers in that department. I think also in a best case scenario for Zac Jones, he claims a top 4 role, at least at the start of the season. Now, when everybody's healthy, I don't know. You could try that, but I get the feeling that, you look at the left side, Lindgren and Miller, certainly both ahead of him on the depth chart. But right now, Lindgren is not in the lineup, which means that a top 4 role for Zac Jones is basically right there for the taking. The Rangers have a lot of options as far as how they want to line up on opening night. If there's a situation where, say Lindgren is only going to miss 2 or 3 games, which seems unlikely. But again, they're so vague with the timetable when it comes to when a player is going to get back from injuries that maybe it is. Maybe it is possible. Maybe, and you should never bet against a hockey player beating their timetable in the first place. So it's at least possible that Lindgren gets back into the lineup a little bit sooner than we all expect. But if Lindgren is only going to miss, say, 2 or 3 games, then I would see the Rangers on their top pairing with Adam Fox, most likely going with a placeholder type of defenseman, whether that's Victor Mancini, whether that's a veteran like Connor Mackey, maybe even Chad Ruhwedel gets in the lineup. I don't think I'd put him on the top pairing, but it's at least possible. They got a lot of different options. It depends on who makes the team and who doesn't. But I do think it should be Mancini. We'll see how the Rangers feel about that. But if the opposite happens, and if Ryan Lindgren is going to be out of the lineup for, more than just a couple of weeks, it ends up being a couple of months or whatever the case might be, then maybe in that situation, you look to try Zac Jones with Adam Fox. It was very short-lived, but when Zac Jones first made his NHL debut, the Rangers were pretty much out of the playoff race, for the most part, I guess somewhat within striking distance. But Jones was up for a cup of coffee at the end of the season, and he played with Adam Fox, and I thought the two of them really kind of clicked very well together. I tend to like, a dynamic defenseman paired with kind of the tough guy stay-at-home defenseman. And this would be, two, I don't want to say offense first defenseman because that's a disservice to Adam Fox. He's a phenomenal all-around defenseman, but the dynamic type of defenseman, you could still try it though. That's at least an option. Zac Jones could be with Adam Fox. Maybe you go with, if you're the Rangers, Miller and Fox as the top pairing, and then maybe Zac Jones is on the second pairing. That's also entirely possible, especially, again, with Ryan Lindgren not being available. In that situation, is Jones with Trouba? Is Jones with Schneider? We'll see. I would prefer Schneider in the top 4 role over Trouba, but I think the Rangers are going to do the opposite of that, at least to start the season. But we'll see. Bottom line, there's a lot of different ways it could shake out, and Zac Jones, he's gone from, probably last year and maybe even the year before that, being deserving of a spot in the lineup, but there just not being one available to, man, he's got a tremendous opportunity in front of him here to take the bull by the horns, make himself a mainstay in the lineup, and essentially just never look back. Could be a little bit of a sink or swim moment for Zac Jones early in the season if you put him out there with Adam Fox or if he's in a top 4 role in general. I think he swims, though. I'm expecting Zac Jones to have a solid season for the New York Rangers. I think also in a best case scenario, and we touched on this briefly, a few minutes ago, best case scenario, though, Zac Jones gets the job on the second power play unit. For me, it's kind of a toss-up between Jones and K'Andre Miller. You're going to have at least one defenseman out there, you'd have to think. I mean, I've seen more teams every once in a while for their power play. They'll go with 5 forwards, but that doesn't usually happen. And honestly, I can't even remember the last time the Rangers have done that. I'm not sure if they've ever really done that, at least not with any regularity since I've been a fan of this team. Maybe somebody will remind me of, back in 2010, back in 2007. I don't know, but it's been a long time. That's the bottom line. But yeah, I mean, to me, it comes down to Jones or Miller. Or how about this? You could, on the second power play unit, put both of them out there. That's the other thing, too. We're so used to seeing 4 forwards and 1 defenseman on every power play unit. It's not illegal to go with 2 defensemen. You can do that. If the Rangers go that route, you could go with those 2 defensemen, Lafreniere, Hedl, and Smith. You can give that a try. I mean, that's assuming that the top power play unit stays intact and it's the same 5 players that, we've been seeing. Although there's kind of a ripple effect right now because Panarin's status is somewhat in question for opening night. And if he doesn't play on the top power play unit, you got to believe that's going to be Lafreniere's spot. He's going to move up to that unit. Now you've got another opening on the second unit. Maybe Kakko's there. Kakko, Hedl, Smith, Miller, Jones. You can give that a shot. I'd like to see. And to me, that's the fairest way to do it, too, because if you are in a situation eventually where you want to go with only Jones or only Miller on the second power play unit, well, you know what? Give them both a chance at the start of the season. See who performs better in that role. And if you want to go to 4 forwards and 1 defenseman a little bit later in the season, well, you've got a bunch of games under your belt, and you can look back and see how each of them did and make your decision based on that. And Zac Jones, he's at least in the mix for that, quarterbacking the second power play. I think also in a best case scenario for Zac Jones, we see a little bit more offense this season. I talked about the hypothetical, theoretical offense, call it whatever you want to call it. But when you look at what Zac Jones has done in the NHL, and part of this is the fact that he doesn't get a ton of ice time and plays with such a regularity. He's never been a permanent fixture in the lineup. He's always in and out of the lineup. But 69 games for Zac Jones, 3 goals, 14 assists. He's produced points at a higher clip in the AHL and really everywhere else that he's played than that. And I do think that, if he starts to get a little bit more ice time, and certainly if he's involved in the power play at least a little bit, you could see a little bit of an uptick in his points. But I think, more offense from Zac Jones, especially now that he's played in the NHL a little bit, got a career high in games last year. I want to say 31 games for Jones last year. You got to figure, the more he's in the lineup, the more comfortable he'll get, the more offense that he'll get to show. There's certainly more offense to his game than that amount of points and that amount of games that I just mentioned there. But going to keep everything rolling in just a second. I want to shift our attention to Braden Schneider, who, when everybody's healthy, could be Zac Jones's defense partner, possibly on the third pairing. Depends how the Rangers want to do it. But we are going to, once again, shift our attention to Braden Schneider in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Want to conclude today's episode by talking a little bit about Braden Schneider, who, for worst case scenarios, and again, we're going to do this the way we always do it, start with the bad and with the good, glass half full, all that good stuff. But worst case scenarios for Braden Schneider, not an easy player to come up with a whole lot of stuff, but one thing that did kind of pop into my head here, the plateau effect. I think, to compare it to one of Schneider's teammates, let's look at Ryan Lindgren, right? And take the fact that he's injured off the table right now. I'm a big fan of Ryan Lindgren. I've said that, one of my favorite players, possibly my favorite player on the team right now. But one of the reasons why I think there's so many fans out there that are so willing and borderline eager to move on from Ryan Lindgren after this season, in addition to the injury history and whatever it might cost to hang on to him, is the fact that Lindgren, even when he's completely healthy, it does feel like, and even I have to admit this as a huge Ryan Lindgren fan, it does feel like he is somewhat of a finished product. What you see is what you get for Ryan Lindgren, and I do think he's going to continue to, be a really strong defenseman in this league for a lot of years to come, whether it's with the Rangers or not after this season. I think you'll see him, get a decent deal, solid deal for himself, and find himself in a top 4 role with whichever team he ends up playing for. However, there is kind of this sense, at least that I have, maybe you guys do too, that this is as good as he's ever going to get. And he is a rock-solid NHL defenseman. Take nothing away. Tough as nails. Leads the NHL in blood spilled. Will happily sacrifice his body. Plays that old-school kind of hockey that I think a lot of Ranger fans really love. But to bring it back to Braden Schneider, could the same thing happen to him? Have we already seen, the best that Braden Schneider has to offer? It's at least possible, but I don't think so. I do think that Braden Schneider has a little bit higher of a ceiling than a lot of people realize. I remember going back to the draft when the Rangers chose him in the first round. That was the same year they got Lafreniere. Lafreniere was obviously number 1. Schneider was like somewhere around 20, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe like 19. But Rangers draft him, and the thing that was interesting about him to me is a lot of the scouts were saying that this is the safest pick maybe in the entire draft class. Where this guy doesn't have superstar upside, but looking at his game and everything that he does well, there was no reason to believe at that point when they drafted him. And you can see that playing out over these last couple of years here. There was no reason to believe that Braden Schneider would not go on to be just a solid NHL defenseman, a really good player, if maybe not a spectacular player. And I think we've seen that kind of come to fruition the last few years here. But I do think that we have not yet seen the best of Braden Schneider. I'm not saying he's going to be like a perennial Norris candidate or anything like that, or he's going to have 25 minutes a night for the Rangers every single game for the rest of his career. I'm not saying that, but I do think that we've seen Braden Schneider just steadily improve, steadily get more comfortable at the NHL level. I feel like, throughout the years, we're going to see his ice time certainly increase. He's a top 4 defenseman that's been playing on the bottom pairing. And that's just a case of basically the Rangers having the luxury of having, some well-established defensemen in this league. Now, last year, we saw him move into a top 4 role somewhat briefly. He was there when Trouba was hurt, and he was there after Trouba came back. The first half of the Ranger playoff run, Braden Schneider was in the top 4. Then they flip-flopped them again, and that's certainly up for debate, how they line up this year, who's in the top 4 and who's not, between Trouba and Schneider. My preference is Schneider gets into the top 4 over Trouba. We'll see how they look to go. But, Schneider's going to have a bigger and bigger role going forward here, so I don't really think that he has plateaued. And I do think the best is yet to come when it comes for Braden Schneider. Something else in a worst case scenario, which, this one could go either way now that I'm thinking about it. But one thing that I'll say here, as far as a worst case scenario, he's not able to outplay Jacob Trouba and take over the top 4. And at first, because I put my bullet points here and I'm thinking okay, that's probably a bad thing, right? If he's not able to eclipse Trouba, that could be a good thing though, because that could mean, I'm keeping my fingers crossed here, I don't know how likely this is, but that could mean that Jacob Trouba comes back with a vengeance this year. And I don't know that he's ever going to be an $8 million a year defenseman. I've never felt like he's been quite at that level, but can he get closer to that than the way he played last year and certainly in the playoffs last year? Yeah, I think that's at least possible. So if Braden Schneider doesn't make it into the top 4, part of the reason for that could be that Jacob Trouba has improved. But I think in a worst case scenario for Schneider, like I said, he's just not able to eclipse Trouba. To me, it seemed like Schneider was the better all around and just frankly more reliable defenseman than Jacob Trouba in that playoff run. I felt a heck of a lot better about the Rangers and what they were going to do defensively when Braden Schneider was on the ice in the playoffs last year than I did for Jacob Trouba. And again, I can't speak for everybody. You guys let me know how you felt about that. But if it's up to me, Schneider does get that spot in the top 4. Worst case scenario, though, he's not able to pass by Jacob Trouba and remains in the bottom pairing, which even as I say that, again, it's not like a complete disaster because now it's a luxury. You've got a guy that's fully capable of playing in the top 4 that's on your bottom pairing. So that's not the worst thing either. Best case scenarios for Braden Schneider. I think in a best case, Schneider begins to get trusted by Laviolette and the coaching staff a little bit more in bigger spots, high leverage spots in the game. I think overall he does have the trust of the coaching staff. But when the game's on the line, when you're in a situation where the Rangers are up by a goal and there's a minute left, 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left, it's usually the big 4 as far as the defensemen that are on the ice for the Rangers. You've got Fox, you've got Lindgren, you've got Miller, and you've got Trouba. And those are usually the guys out there trying to protect that 1-goal lead and trying to secure the win for the New York Rangers. Schneider is not quite as much of a go-to defenseman for this team as the 4 players that I just mentioned. But that could change this year because, again, Schneider is getting more experience in the NHL. He seems to be getting better and better with every passing season. And honestly, it might have to change in the early parts of the season because, once again, this team is going to be without Ryan Lindgren for at least a certain amount of games. We don't know how many, but at least a few. And I realize, Lindgren, he plays the left side. Schneider plays the right side. You know what? There's always a way around that. And the bottom line, anytime anybody goes down, like especially a defenseman, there's only 6 defensemen that dress every single night. So that has a ripple effect through the entire lineup. And the fact that Ryan Lindgren is unavailable, again, I know he plays a different side than Schneider, but I think you're going to see Schneider, his ice time will increase a little bit, and he'll have a bigger role for this team at the start of the season. And in addition to, Schneider maybe getting some looks late in games, maybe a little bit more penalty killing for Schneider this season as well. We will see. I think also in a best case scenario, and this is one that I talked about this in the very intro to the show before we hit Passafire's awesome song there and, the whole song and dance there. I talked about something that Braden Schneider does for this team for which he does not get nearly enough credit. And that's the fact that he has been a total chameleon since coming onto this team. He has been a total Swiss Army knife. Use whatever analogy you want to use. But I think one of the most underrated parts of Braden Schneider's game since he's come into the NHL, 2.5 seasons now, is how adaptable he's been. I'm going to go ahead and list. I think I was able to do this. I tried to make a list real quick before I hit the episode of every defense partner that Braden Schneider has had. And I'm not going to count, like, if he was with somebody for just one game, we're not going to count that. We're not going to count, like, Brandon Scanlon last year, anything like that. But these are players that have been Schneider's defense partner for at least a decent amount of games. Certainly not the whole season, but listen to this list here. So you've got Patrick Nemeth, Justin Braun, Nico Mikkola, Ben Harper, Zac Jones, Nils Lundqvist. I'm going to count Jared Tenorti. He wasn't in the lineup that often, but I think they were out there together, if I'm remembering it correctly. But even if you don't count him, it's still a lot. And then this past season, both Eric Gustafsson and Keandre Miller. So what is that, like 8 or 9 that I just mentioned there? 2.5 seasons. 2.5 seasons for Braden Schneider. He's had 8 or 9 different defense partners, and he's made it work with all of them. These are defensemen that they're all different ages. They all have vastly different skill sets. They have different strengths. They have different weaknesses. And Braden Schneider has been that consistent with this revolving door of defensemen that he's playing next to. That's impressive no matter who you are. But the fact that Braden Schneider debuted in the middle of a really strong season for the Rangers, one that saw them get to the Eastern Conference Final and lose to Tampa at the age of 20, and he's had to adjust on the fly and get used to all these different defensemen and just basically not miss a beat with any of them. I mean, not to say he's never had a bad game, but you get what I'm saying. For the most part, Braden Schneider just makes it work with an offensive defenseman, a stay-at-home defenseman, a big defenseman, a small defenseman, an old defenseman, a young defenseman. It doesn't matter. You can throw anybody out there, and Braden Schneider is going to make it work. And I think that that's something that, again, is very underrated part of his game. And he may have to do that again this year because the Ranger blue line right now is in a little bit of a state of flux given the injury to Ryan Lindgren. That's going to cause, as we talked about before, a little bit of a ripple effect. We don't know how the Rangers are going to line up on opening night. There's a little bit of an imbalance right now because Ryan Lindgren's one of your, left defensemen. Could Schneider play the left side? I don't know. We haven't really seen him do that. I don't think, at least not, with any regularity or anything like that. But it's huge, man. It's huge that he can go out there and play with all these different defense partners and find a way to make it work and find a way to be, a solid contributing member of this team, regardless of who he shares the ice with. Very, very important stuff. So I figure we can pretty much call it there. I do want to once again remind everybody, because we're going to do this episode in the very near future. It might even be the episode after this one or 2 episodes after this one. But we are going to be reading all of your stories that you share with me from where you were, who you were with, what you were doing when the Rangers won any of their 4 playoff overtime games from this last season's Stanley Cup run. It's been a lot of fun hearing some of your stories. We had Ryan Sharkey on the other night. He was the runner-up in the Fantasy League last year. Big shout out to Ryan. He already shared his story on the show, but you guys can send me your stories as well. We're going to do a whole episode of that. And as I mentioned in the last episode, whether it's this episode that we're talking about now or any other mailbag episode, you can email me or DM me on Twitter. You can also send in an audio form of your question or a video form of your question. We can do that just as easily here on Locked On New York Rangers. It's however you want to do it, personal preference. So, yep, figure we can call it there. Once again, if you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well at LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.